Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. I may have once remarked that when, for instance, the ultra-orthodox require all their men learn Torah and not work for a living, they are recreating a tradition in a world that never existed. In this week's Parsha Ha'azinu, Moshe admonishes us to ask your parent who will inform you. And we explore the preservation and invention of custom in the Rabbinic tradition up until today. So join us for Inventing Tradition. Well, welcome back, Rabbi, and Happy New Year to you. The first
Happy New Year.
podcast of
Shana
the year.
Tova. Shana Tova to everybody. Hope you had a nice Rosh Hashanah.
It was great, and I love the fact that when I called you last week and I said, I'm looking at Sefaria, there's no Parsha this week. Does that mean we have the week off? And you said yes, and I said, wow,
so
that's fantastic.
For the next two, well, we have to talk about it. Next week is Sukkot, but 2 weeks is Vizot HaBracha, which we read on Sunday, but probably we should have a podcast on Thursday.
Okay, so you're saying that we have another day off this week, the next week?
Yeah, we have another week. This week we have off. A week from now we have off because Sukkot there's no parasha. But I think the following week we should finish off the cycle with Vizot HaBracha, and maybe Geoffrey, we can announce 2 weeks from now what we're going to be doing the following year.
I'd love to do that because that would mean I would know. Okay, fantastic. We have a plan. So it is the new year, and I would venture to guess that a lot of what happens on the new year is a mixture of nostalgia and preserving customs. I must say, with Yom Kippur coming up, when I hear the first two bars of Kol Nidre, You've Got Me, tradition is a very powerful thing. And that's what we're really going to talk about today. And we're going to use our Parsha as a point of departure. But we're going to talk about how tradition is used and maybe misused. But here we go. We are in Deuteronomy 32, and this might be the only Parsha where it's only one chapter. It's an amazing song, Ha'azinu, and it's just one Parsha, 32 in Deuteronomy. And in verse 7, it says, "Remember the days of old, consider the years of ages past, Dor vador. Ask your parent who will inform you, your elders who will tell you. Sha'al avicha v'yagedcha, zikeinecha v'yomu loch." Every so often we come across a pasuk that is a little bit of a bumper sticker. This is right up there, and it kind of continues the theme one more time in the Parsha. In verse 17, it's talking, and Ha'azinu starts really nice, but it gets kind of it's harsh. It's telling the Jewish people, you think that you can forget me, you think that you can worship new gods. It's not going to work out. And in 32:17, it says, "They sacrificed to demons no gods they had never known, new ones who came but lately, who stirred not your forebears' fears. Chadashim mikarev ba'u lo shorim avotechem." So at least twice in the Parsha, it makes reference to our parents, to our forebears. It makes reference to look back and learn the lessons of the past, and be very wary when you do something chadash, something new. And before I open this up, Rabbi, I'm fascinated to hear your comments. The other bumper sticker verse is in Mishlei in Proverbs. "My son, heed the discipline of your father, and do not forsake the instruction of your mother. Shema b'ni musar avicha, va'al titosh Torah timecha." These two verses I would present today are really the source of tradition, of the past, of listening to the lessons of the past. Am I right here, Rabbi?
You're so right. And actually, the Talmud itself, as we'll see in the source material, the Talmud itself is familiar with this. They know that this means that you have to keep tradition. The Gemara actually has a question about Hanukkah. You know, Hanukkah is not in the Torah because the holiday of Hanukkah didn't happen until much after the Torah. And the Talmud asked, how do we know you have to light Hanukkah candles? And they say, Sha'ala vicha v'yagedcha zikenecha v'yomrulach, that's part of tradition. So these psukim are very powerful, and very good for this, for this discussion.
Absolutely. And, Rashi, for instance, the traditional interpretation of our verses is because, as I said before, Ha'azinu, if you read it and you listen to it in Shul this Shabbat, it's a harsh reprimand. It says when it listens to what happened to your forebears, it's really talking about history, less practice. Rashi says, remember the days of old, what he did to previous generations who provoked him to anger. So I think we are going to focus on minhag and tradition, but clearly there's a part of this that has to do with doggone history. You got to know your past. And we're going to go off on a little segue because, as you know from the text I sent you last night, Rabbi, on Sefirah, and you all should know by this time what Sefirah is, the source sheet is attached to this podcast, is an index of all Jewish knowledge. And you can put in a verse such as ours and see where it came up in the Midrash and where it came up in the Talmud. And something like this, because I was interested in how it was treated through the generations, I asked it, what did the responsa literature, how did it use these verses? And I came up with an answer that is really very different from where we're going to go with this, but I was so blown away that I had to read parts of it to you because it does have synergy with other things that we've been saying this year, especially when talking about the demonstrations. So there is a collection of responsa made by a yeshiva called Kolel Eretz Chemda. And as I said, I came to it because it quotes our verse. And the question, as in all responsa, that is posed to the rabbi is a Torah permitted to Kahanim on Mount Herzl? And the question here says, I lead tours on Mount Herzl, and it's very important that every Jew, every soldier, every teenager, every kid in high school sees what's going on. But I get resistance from those soldiers and students who are Kohanim, and how do I navigate? And the rabbi who answers the question says as follows, and it's worth really quoting in full. And he says, an independent Jewish state is an integral part of the complete spiritual world of the people of Israel. Unfortunately, only for a relatively short time out of our long history did the people of Israel receive this gift from God. In the last 100 years, the people of Israel have had the privilege of seeing the fulfillment of large parts of the vision of the prophets and seeing eye to eye the return of Zion. That is, as dreamers, a national resurrection, Tchiyat HaMeitim, of the people. Miracle is happening before our eyes. The one who had the privilege of driving the process as a man of vision and action was Benjamin Zev Herzl. This is a religious Orthodox tshuva. That is why it is imperative to educate future generations and bring them his legacy so that they understand the breadth and the depth of his vision. The continued existence and strengthening of the state of Israel also depends on knowing the roots and the actions that ultimately led to the miracle taking place. Considering the verse, remember forever between the years of generation and generation, your father asked and your elders told you, and your elders said to you. He quotes our verse. And according to the words of Yigal Yadin, the general and the archaeologist, he who does not have a past does not have a future either. Therefore, we must learn and teach about the people and processes that led to the establishment of the state, and we are commanded, he uses the word mitzvah, to participate in the tours of Mount Herzl that teach about this. That is why it is necessary to arrange for a tour of the mountain that even Kohanim can participate. He goes on to explain that actually halachic guidelines and maps have actually been made to help Kohanim navigate. And then he goes into detail guidance for visiting Herzl so that you can see Herzl's grave, the head of the world Histadrut, Herzl's children, the Gedolei Ha'umah, Jabotinsky, monuments of the victims of the hostilities of terrorism, and the monuments of refugees. So he takes our verse. It's the only biblical verse that he brings in his teshuvah to explain the mitzvah, the importance of knowing our real history. So, Rabbi, whatever we talk about today in terms of Talmudics and Midrashim and even history and sociology, the bottom line is we're starting with the Peshat, the simple meaning of the text, which is, as Yigal Yadin says, you don't have a future unless you know your past. What do you think of that teshuvah?
First of all, the tshuva is amazing, and the quote is amazing. You don't have a future unless you know your past. That sums up Jewish history, Jewish religious history in one little phrase, right? It's all about the fact that we live the past. And I want to give you an example. This is a great example. Kol Nidre. So interestingly enough, when the Reform movement started, they eliminated Kol Nidre because, it's about how you can nullify your vows. And they thought that it made Jews look crooked. The fact that we take vows, we promise things, and we don't fulfill our vows. So they didn't like Kol Nidre. But even though they eliminated Kol Nidre, they used to have the organ play the tune of Kol Nidre because the tune was holy. The tune was part of our tradition. So they eliminated the words, but the tune made it. I think that's part of the value of nostalgia and the value of tradition.
Absolutely, and it's so much pertinent for this time of year that we feel it so much. But before I leave this, I have argued because of Hakarat HaTov, because of recognizing what has been done for you, that so little of the discussion today between the warring parties in Israel has to do what was the vision of Herzl, what was the vision of Ben Gurion, what was the vision of the early generation. It's as though they don't exist, and people are recreating history or whitewashing history without them. And that's what I found so fascinating about this teshuvah, that they talk about people like Herzl and Yigal Yadin that are clearly not religious Jews, but clearly responsible for where we are today. And I think we can say whatever we want about the verses, and we will, but ultimately that's the core message of them. Remember your past. But we are talking about minhagim, about tradition, and how they play out in Jewish tradition. So I'm going to give a few examples, and I think the examples kind of give you the universe of discourse, the elements that come up constantly when we discuss traditions. The first one comes from the Mishnah in Brachot, and it actually has to do is, can you greet somebody with God's name? And the rabbis go ahead and they give examples of Boaz, who says, the Lord is with you, and may the Lord bless you. And they give examples from the book of Judges. But then they seem to bring up a tradition that one did not actually speak God's name. It was maybe a desecration of God's name or a misappropriation of God's name. Hashem. And they come and they said that lest you say that mentioning God's name is prohibitive, it says it is a time to work for the Lord. They have made void your Torah. So it seems that when it comes to customs, the one thing that stands in front of customs is something that we call Eit La'asot Lashem. This is a pivotal moment, and what they're saying is that when there is a pivotal moment, Chafru Toratecha, you can break the rules. Rabbi Natan Omer, Chafru Toratecha et la'asot lad Hashem. He flips the verse around and says, at a time where the Torah is under attack, in his day he was referring to the fundamentalists, the Tzedukim, that is a time to innovate. So rather than get into the weeds of the exact discussion, and there are some explanations that I've put in the notes, it's fascinating that even this early, when it comes to either keeping a custom or abrogating a custom, you get into these moments. And we're going to see that has taken over how customs are either created, fulfilled, or whatever. Is that part of the lexicography, Rabbi? Am I right there?
I think you're right there. I think customs are a hard thing. Every tradition has a custom. In a way, Thanksgiving is a custom, right? I mean, it's something that developed and everybody has their own Thanksgiving traditions. So customs are a very important part of religion, and they're also a very important part of culture, I think, of society.
You say very important. They can become overwhelmingly important. Anyone who's been
like
involved
Thanksgiving. And you don't have a future unless you know your past. Doesn't that describe Thanksgiving?
We at Madlik love to think that it's the halacha, and it's the perush, and it's the commentary. But what some of the sources are teaching us today is, forget about all of that. It's really the custom. It's what you feel comfortable with or where you want to go. And I think Thanksgiving is a perfect example. You don't have to say, how big is the bird and when do you eat it? And do you eat it before the stuffing or after? It's just the custom. And I think that in Judaism, custom plays a critical role. I want to quote the Talmud that you referred to earlier in Sukkah, that talks about the blessing that we make on Hanukkah. And of course, every blessing that we have, we say, blessed are you, O Lord our God, who has commanded us, and commanded us to light the Hanukkah light. And the rabbis, not known to pull a punch, say, where did God command us to light a menorah? Because the Hashmonaim attacked the Jews, Hashmonaim Empire. And so the answer that is given is that, one, you shall not turn aside from the sentence which shall declare unto you right and wrong. So it's obviously talking about rabbinic power to innovate. But Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said that the mitzvah to heed the voice of the elders is derived from the verse, ask your father, and he will declare unto you your elders, and they will tell you. Our verse in Deuteronomy. So in a sense, it's tongue-in-cheek where we are saying that our custom has the same level of importance as the Torah commandments itself. And that was, if you recall, we had a discussion a few weeks ago about Gerim, converts, and how can they say blessings, Asher who is commanded by our fathers when they have not. So this is another legal fiction that luckily puts us all into the same boat as converts, where we are saying we are allowed to live a legal fiction and to innovate. But it is a powerful statement, and in this case, we're really talking about rabbinic authority as much as anything else, are we not?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. And that gives authority to the custom. You see, there is a question whether customs can come from the bottom up. Can customs come from the community? That's an interesting question, also, isn't it? Right? Does it have to come from the rabbis, or can it come bottom up?
And when we talk about minhag, sometimes we talk about modern phrases, but minhag is a word, and it is recognized in the Mishnah, in the Talmud. There are discussions about whether you can work on Erev Pesach, and there were some places that they worked Erev Pesach, they went to the office, and some places where they did not. And all of a sudden we get a new word into our lexicon, Rabbi, and we're talking about chumrei makom, the stringencies of a place. So traditions are also ones that are traditions for leniency and traditions for strictness, for difficulty. And you see discussions whenever a minhag is brought up around those two. There are stories in the Talmud about a community in Bet Shan that they did not travel to Tyre, to Sidon on a Friday because of the Shabbat. And their children said, well, our fathers were wealthy and they didn't go there because they didn't have to get to the market. But we are not so wealthy. So there are instances, again, where traditions are onerous. And the question then becomes, even though it's not halacha, it's not law, do you have to keep the traditions? There are other instances of, and this comes up to even till today, of nusach, of prayer. If I am a woman and I pray in nusach Sepharad and I marry someone who is nusach Ashkenaz, what tradition do I follow? Traditions can also be a burden, can be an onus, and can be a challenge and a place of friction for us too. It's all not just this nostalgia and the good old days, right?
Well, that's interesting when you have competing traditions, competing customs, a husband and wife, someone who finds him or herself in a community that's not their native community. So whose customs win out? On Passover, there are two different customs, whether or not you eat kitniot, rice. So the Ashkenazim don't eat rice and the Sephardim do eat rice. But what about if an Ashkenazi man marries a Moroccan woman or vice versa? Which way does it go? That's such an interesting question, isn't it?
It is, but it does show that traditions can unite us, but traditions can also divide us. So the name of today's podcast is Inventing Tradition, and I didn't really invent that word. It comes from a beautiful article in a book. There's a book called "The Uses of Tradition: Jewish Continuity in the Modern Era," and it's edited by Jack Wertheimer. And there's one monograph, one chapter in it that I have put a link in the Sefirah notes that I encourage all of you that find this fascinating to check out. It's The Emergence of Ultra-Orthodoxy, the Invention of a Tradition by Michael K. Silber. And the premise of the article is, and I'm quoting, of all the branches of modern-day Judaism, ultra-Orthodoxy is undoubtedly the most tradition-oriented. Its rallying cry is, all innovation is prohibited by the Torah, Chadash Asur min HaTorah. And yet, like other anti-modern conservative movements, ultra-Orthodoxy itself is clearly a recent phenomenon, but as much a child of modernity. So I made a comment before, when we see in Israel today that all the young students are told you have to learn Torah all the time, and you can't go to the army, you can't work. I always argue that they are recreating a world that never existed. In other words, in the shtetl, there was always a Tevye the milkman. There was always the peddler. There were thousands, a high percentage of the Jews eked out a living, and only the most gifted studied in the yeshiva. And the ultra-orthodox today don't have a foot to stand on when it comes to the Torah, talking about going to the army. There are pasukim about that. They don't have a leg to stand on when it comes to not working. But nonetheless, they have created a tradition that they feel shows fidelity to times past that those of us who study history know never existed. And this article, in a very deep and academic and insightful way, kind of tries to understand the mechanics of that and how that happens. But as he says, and I just quoted, from the beginning, and we can tell by the way the ultra-Orthodox dress. They dress like they came out of Eastern Europe 300 years ago. This is something that began in recent history, and for Jews who measure history in thousands of years, a very, very recent history. And so what we're going to do is explore what he writes a little bit, and he gives many examples, and that's why I encourage you to read the article, but two that we're going to kind of look at in a little more depth. So he says, tradition as it was understood by the mainstream did not prove up to the task of providing a forceful response. He targets the beginning of this ultra-Orthodox movement as one that was less, and this is fascinating about the article, less against reform and more against traditional mainstream Judaism, the Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch's, and he talks about arguments that were had about putting the bima where the bima was, how big the mechitza was, whether you could get married inside, and they would argue that if you do any of these things, it's tantamount to walking into a house of idol worship. So there was a lot of exaggeration. What he brings a few sources that I think would be fascinating to look at. So, and the first has to do with literally with creating customs. And so the argument is that if you have the choice, Rabbi, of saying that something is kosher or treif, we always taught, we're students of Rabbi Riskin, that the great scholar will find a way to make it kosher. But they were the opposite. I knew a businessman who once had a sign behind him that said, "Why make things easy if you can make them impossible?" So the Haredim will kind of say, "Why make things easy if you can make them asur?" And this is a quote: "It is not that we do not know how to rule leniently. On the contrary, but we do know very clearly that in the present state of decline of our poor generation, faith is endangered on all sides, and everyone must admit that a weak, sick body needs more care and protection than a healthy body. Therefore, instead of seeking ways to lighten the burden, rabbis should find reasons to cling to even the most inconsequential traditions. In this orphan generations, it is a holy obligation incumbent upon each and every one to root in his heart from the earliest years to keep and fulfill not only all the commandments, but even the most trifling customs which we receive from our ancestors." So this was not a tick in the program. This was the main program. The idea was to create laws and barriers and stringencies that would make it so difficult to carry that one would be cut off from everybody else. It's the laws that they came up with. Sometimes rabbis wouldn't sign the letter because they said what you're saying is not even halachically true. But nonetheless, what they did was they took the Agadah, they took the Midrash, they were take isolated opinions and build mound hills out of it. I mean, the example that comes to my mind is at the end of Masechta Ketubot, there is an Agadah about 3 oaths. And one of the oaths is that we should not conquer Israel with our old hands. And this was taken for them to say that we can't have our own state. But I think the core insight of this article is that all of this was not done not so much for the particular law, but to create that fence around the Torah, that they felt and they feel today that they are under siege, that they are this dying patient. And anything that they can do to continue the project is worth everything else. And I think it's if we can't understand that, it's hard. You can't rationalize. It's a siege mentality, and I think that's one of the fascinating takeaways I had from the article.
Well, that's an interesting idea. It's also, at least today, post-Holocaust, they feel as if their type, the ultra-orthodox, were destroyed in larger numbers because 90% of Polish Jewry was killed, and most of the ultra-orthodox lived in Poland. So there's also that feeling that they feel attacked because they lost so many people in the Holocaust. That's an important piece of it also.
Yes, but the fascinating part about this article is it kind of focuses a lot on pre, and I'll just give you the 2 insights that really I took away. One of them I'd heard about and the other not. He calls one division of labor. And there's a very simple piece of Talmud that says that a non-Jew is not allowed to study Torah. And we can get into what the original source, what it meant, but Rabbi Schlesinger manipulated the sources. And what he says is the takeaway from a non-Jew is not allowed that studies Torah is culpable with death. He said that therefore a Jew can only live if he only studies Torah. And from there he said that the world is divided into those that produce. The non-Jews are supposed to produce a world for us. They're supposed to build. They're supposed to harvest. And the Jews are supposed to learn. And this is fascinating. Someone once asked why, if we have to be cautious concerning the customs of our forefathers, should we utilize new useful things which Gentile scientists have invented in our times, like a cell phone, I'm adding. They answered him, in matters of human affairs, certainly the new is preferred over the old. For all that is new adds benefit, a rule which does not apply in the conduct of religion whose source is God. The division of labor created a useful mechanism which enables the Jew to benefit from modern civilization as a consumer, but the ambition to be cultural producer had to be unambiguously renounced. It's so fascinating because this was written, 10, 15 years ago, but it really illuminates what their thinking could be, because from us, coming it from the other side, it's hard to understand what their logic is. And what he's saying is that literally they see themselves as fulfilling God's quest, but his argument is that they take one isolated verse or one isolated Agadah, and the other thing that he does is something called Shalem, and it's based on when Jacob arrived Shalem in the city of Shechem. The Talmud says because he kept his name, his language, and dress. And from this they learn that you have to dress like our forefathers dressed, you have to speak like our forefathers spoke, and you have to have the name. And it's just so fascinating how they use tradition in a way that literally has defined them. And I think that if we are all impacted by decisions that are being made, it serves us well to understand where they're coming from, and ultimately the power, as Yigal Yadin said from the beginning, of our history. And our history really does define our future. So as we sit in shul and we get all nostalgic, we should all be very careful about how we use tradition. It's a wonderful thing, but it also is something that can really change the lens that we see life through.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. Shabbat shalom, everybody. Everybody should have an easy and meaningful fast. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. We'll finish up the Torah with Vizot HaBracha. Be well, everybody.
Shana Tova, Gomar Chatima Tova. And if any of you have any ideas of what we should talk about next year, don't be shy.
We're open to listen.
We're open to suggestions. Shana Tova.